This story is inspired by a real near-death experience. Names and events have been altered to protect privacy and enhance dramatization. If you've experienced an NDE or know someone who has, share your story in the comments. The rain battered the windows of a small, dimly lit apartment. Inside, the air was heavy with silence, interrupted only by the distant rumble of thunder and the faint hum of a ceiling fan. Jackson Cole sat hunched on a worn-out couch, staring at the flickering light of the television. The images on the screen blurred together, but he wasn't watching. His mind was far away, trapped in the past. The apartment was cluttered, a reflection of Jackson's internal chaos. Piles of unopened mail sat on the counter. Dishes were stacked haphazardly in the sink, and the faint smell of stale coffee lingered in the air. A single photograph hung on the wall, slightly askew, a younger Jackson in uniform, flanked by his platoon. Their faces were alight with camaraderie and purpose, a stark contrast to the hollow expression Jackson now wore. The war had ended years ago, but for Jackson, it never truly ended. Every night was a battle against the memories that invaded his dreams. Explosions, gunfire, and the faces of comrades who hadn't made it home. They haunted him, their voices whispering in the quiet moments, reminding him of the promises he couldn't keep. His days were no better. He avoided people, avoided conversations that might touch on his time in the military. The world outside his apartment felt alien, like a battlefield where he didn't know the rules. The few times he had ventured out to work or run errands, the noise and chaos of the city had overwhelmed him, triggering the same hypervigilance that had once kept him alive. He glanced at the clock. 3:17 p.m. Hours had slipped by unnoticed, the rain outside growing heavier. Jackson leaned back, closing his eyes, but the silence only brought the memories closer. A sharp intake of breath signaled the beginning of another flashback. He gripped the armrest of the couch, his knuckles white, as his mind transported him back to the desert. The thunder outside became the roar of mortars. The faint hum of the fan transformed into the high-pitched whine of incoming fire. Jackson was no longer in his apartment. He was in the middle of a firefight, his squad pinned down. The air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of gunpowder. He could hear the shouts of his comrades, the cries for backup, and the deafening explosions that followed. In the chaos, a young private named Ramirez had been hit. Jackson could still see the blood spreading across Ramirez's uniform, the panic in his eyes as he reached out. "Don't let me die here," Ramirez had whispered, his voice trembling. Jackson had tried, God, he had tried, but the enemy fire was relentless. The last thing he remembered was dragging Ramirez behind cover, his hands slick with blood, before the world went black. When Jackson woke up in a military hospital days later, Ramirez was gone. The present collides with the past. "Ramirez," Jackson shouted, jerking upright. His chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath. The sound of rain brought him back to the present, but his heart continued to race. He ran a hand through his hair, now damp with sweat, and stood up, pacing the small apartment. The flashbacks were getting worse. He knew he couldn't go on like this, but the thought of seeking help felt impossible. Admitting weakness wasn't something soldiers did. Jackson walked to the kitchen, his hands trembling as he poured a glass of water. He stared out the window, the rain obscuring the view of the city below. For a moment, he thought about calling someone, anyone, but who would understand? His family had stopped trying years ago, their calls becoming less frequent until they disappeared altogether. His former squad mates had scattered across the country, each dealing with their own demons. The glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor. Jackson cursed under his breath, grabbing a towel to clean up the mess. But as he bent down, a loud clap of thunder shook the building, triggering another wave of panic. He stood too quickly, his vision swimming, and stumbled backward. The edge of the counter caught Jackson in the side, sending him sprawling to the floor. His head struck the tiles with a sickening thud, and everything went black. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, a silence deeper and more profound than anything Jackson had ever known. But then, faintly, he heard it, a low, melodic hum, like the sound of wind through distant trees. It grew louder, resonating through his body, pulling him away from the pain and darkness. A strange warmth enveloped him, lifting him into a light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Jackson's last thought before surrendering to the light was of Ramirez, his face etched with both fear and trust. And then Jackson was gone. Jackson opened his eyes, or at least it felt that way. But the world around him was unrecognizable. The sharp pain he had felt moments ago was gone, replaced by an overwhelming sense of weightlessness. He was no longer lying on the cold tile floor of his apartment. Instead, he floated in an endless expanse of light. It wasn't harsh or blinding. It was warm, almost alive, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to match the faint hum resonating in his chest. The space around him defied logic. There were no walls, no ceiling, no discernible ground beneath his feet. Only the infinite glow of the light that surrounded him. Colors shifted within the brightness, hues of gold, blue, and white blending seamlessly like an eternal sunrise. The air, or whatever filled this place, carried a serene stillness, yet it vibrated with energy that Jackson could feel in his very core. "Where am I?" he whispered, his voice dissolving into the vastness. The sound didn't echo. Instead, it seemed to become part of the space, absorbed by the light. As Jackson floated, the light began to shift. Shapes started forming within the glow, faint at first, but growing clearer with every passing moment. What emerged before him took his breath away, a celestial hall stretching infinitely in all directions. Towering pillars of radiant energy arched upward into a sky that seemed to pulse with life. The ground beneath him was a swirling mist of light, its surface shifting and shimmering with every step he took. At the center of the hall stood a tribunal, a circle of radiant figures, their forms indistinct but exuding an undeniable presence. They were not human, yet their energy felt familiar, comforting even. Each figure glowed with a unique hue, their light weaving together into a harmonious spectrum. Jackson hesitated, his mind racing. He felt exposed, as if every part of him, every thought, every memory, was laid bare before these beings. Yet, there was no sense of judgment in their presence, only an overwhelming curiosity and a deep, profound understanding. One of the figures stepped, or rather, flowed forward. Its light pulsed gently as it communicated, not with words, but with thoughts that resonated directly in Jackson's mind. "You stand at the intersection of life and eternity," the figure conveyed. "Your time is not yet over, but there is much you must see before you return." The tribunal's light intensified, and the space around Jackson shifted. Suddenly, he was no longer in the hall. Instead, he stood in a familiar scene, a dusty desert battlefield, the air thick with smoke and the deafening roar of gunfire. He was back in the war, but this time, he wasn't a participant. He was an observer, watching himself move through the chaos. He saw himself pulling wounded comrades to safety, barking orders to his squad, and risking his life to protect others. Every action was imbued with a desperate determination to survive, not just for himself, but for those around him. He felt pride watching these moments unfold, but that pride was tempered by the weight of responsibility. The scene shifted again. This time, he saw Ramirez, the young private he hadn't been able to save. The memory was as vivid as ever. Ramirez's pleading eyes, the blood soaking through his uniform, the helplessness Jackson had felt. But now, the tribunal's light revealed something new, the ripple effect of his actions. He saw Ramirez's family, grieving but finding solace in the knowledge that Jackson had tried. He saw his squad mates, inspired by his bravery even in the face of loss. Jackson's efforts, though incomplete in his eyes, had sent ripples of courage and hope through those he had touched. The light shifted again, and Jackson found himself standing in his apartment. It was as it had been before his fall, cluttered, dimly lit, and heavy with silence. He saw himself sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the television, his face etched with exhaustion and pain. The vision moved closer, showing Jackson's inner turmoil. He watched himself flinch at the sound of thunder, recoil from memories of the battlefield, and drown in guilt over the comrades he had lost. The tribunal's light revealed the threads of fear and isolation that had woven themselves into his life, binding him to a cycle of survival without purpose. "You carry the weight of survival as though it is a burden," the tribunal conveyed. But survival is not an end. It is a beginning. To live is to create meaning from the pain, to transform what was lost into something new. Jackson felt a surge of emotion, shame, grief, and the faint stirrings of hope. He had been alive for years, but he hadn't truly lived. He had let his pain define him, forgetting that survival was a gift, not a punishment. The hall returned, the glowing figures of the tribunal surrounding Jackson once more. Their light pulsed in unison, filling the space with a resonance that seemed to vibrate in Jackson's chest. "You have seen the threads of your actions," the tribunal conveyed. "Each choice, each moment, weaves a tapestry that connects you to the lives of others. But your tapestry is incomplete. Your survival was not meant to end in isolation. It is a thread in a greater design." Jackson felt the weight of their words settle over him. The guilt and pain he had carried for years hadn't been erased, but they no longer felt like chains. Instead, they felt like a challenge, a call to action. "What am I supposed to do?" Jackson asked, his voice trembling. The tribunal's light flared, brighter than ever. "You must return," they conveyed. "Your purpose lies not in the past, but in what you will create. Transform your survival into meaning. Help others find their way through the darkness you have known." Jackson's chest tightened, but this time it wasn't fear. It was determination. He didn't fully understand what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't let his survival be in vain. The light around him began to fade, the celestial hall dissolving into darkness. Jackson felt himself being pulled downward, the weight of his body returning as consciousness crept back in. The last thing he saw was the tribunal's radiant glow, a silent reminder of the message they had imparted. And then, with a gasp, Jackson opened his eyes. Jackson's gasp for air was met with the sterile scent of antiseptic and the hum of medical equipment. His vision blurred before focusing on the glaring lights above him. The cold of the hospital bed beneath him was a harsh contrast to the warmth of the tribunal's radiant glow. For a moment, he lay still, disoriented and overwhelmed, the weight of his body unfamiliar after the ethereal lightness of the other realm. But before he could fully grasp the surroundings, the memories of the celestial tribunal flooded back. The towering figures of light, the infinite hall, the moments of courage and failure they had shown him. It was as if the experience had imprinted itself into his very soul. Jackson closed his eyes, the vivid images of the life review replaying in his mind. He remembered standing in the desert, seeing himself pull his comrades to safety, the sweat and fear etched into his face. He also remembered the moments when he faltered, when guilt and exhaustion paralyzed him. Most haunting of all was Ramirez's final moments. The blood, the desperation, the loss. But the tribunal had shown him something beyond his guilt, the ripples of his actions. Ramirez's family, his squad mates, even strangers impacted by his courage. Each moment of bravery had spread outward, touching lives in ways Jackson had never imagined. Yet, the tribunal's words echoed in his mind. Survival is not an end. It is a beginning. He sat up slowly, his body protesting with every movement. A nurse noticed and rushed to his side, her expression a mixture of relief and concern. "You're awake," she said, her tone gentle but professional. "You've been through a lot. Rest for now." Jackson nodded, though his mind was anything but at rest. He couldn't shake the tribunal's final message. Transform your survival into meaning. But how? What did that even mean for someone like him? Over the next few days, Jackson's physical recovery progressed, but the emotional toll of his experience weighed heavily. Each night in the quiet of his hospital room, he replayed the tribunal's judgment, The glowing figures had shown him a life filled with both triumphs and regrets, but they had also made it clear that his story wasn't over. One evening, as the sky outside darkened, Jackson found himself staring at his reflection in the window. His face was pale and drawn, the lines around his eyes deeper than he remembered. He looked older, worn, and tired. But there was something else, a glimmer of determination that hadn't been there before. "I've been alive, but I haven't been living," he muttered to himself, the words tasting foreign yet true. The turning point came when a visitor arrived. It was a fellow veteran, someone Jackson hadn't seen in years. Greg had served in the same unit, and while they hadn't been particularly close, their shared experiences had bonded them in ways only soldiers could understand. Greg entered the room hesitantly, his hulking frame filling the doorway. "Jackson," he said, his voice gruff but warm. "Heard you had a rough go of it." Jackson managed a weak smile. "You could say that." Greg pulled up a chair, his movements deliberate. "I know we haven't talked much since we got back, but when I heard you were here, I had to come. You saved my ass out there more times than I can count. Figured I owed you a visit." The sincerity in Greg's words caught Jackson off guard. He had spent so long fixating on his failures that he hadn't considered the lives he had impacted. "I didn't do enough," Jackson said, his voice trembling. "I couldn't save Ramirez. I couldn't save..." Greg cut him off, his tone firm but compassionate. "You did more than enough. You think Ramirez's family blames you? They don't. You think the rest of us don't see what you gave out there? You gave everything, man. And now you're still here. That's gotta mean something." Jackson stared at Greg, the weight of his words sinking in. The tribunal's message echoed in his mind. Transform your survival into meaning. After Greg left, Jackson sat in silence, his thoughts racing. For years, he had believed his survival was a punishment, a cruel twist of fate that left him to bear the burden of guilt and loss. But what if the tribunal was right? What if survival was a gift, an opportunity to create something new? He thought about Ramirez's family, about Greg, about the countless others who had been affected by his actions, both in combat and afterward. The tribunal had shown him the threads of connection, the way his choices rippled outward, touching lives in ways he couldn't always see. Jackson's mind drifted to the present. Here he was, alive, with the chance to make a difference. But how? The answer wasn't clear, but for the first time in years, he felt the stirrings of hope. That night, Jackson dreamed of the tribunal. The celestial figures stood before him once more, their light pulsing in a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat. The hall was silent, but the message was clear. You are not finished. Your purpose awaits. When he awoke, Jackson felt a clarity he hadn't known before. The weight of guilt was still there, but it no longer felt insurmountable. Instead, it felt like a challenge, a call to action. He sat up in bed, his body aching but his mind resolute. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing. He couldn't stay trapped in the past. It was time to move forward, to find purpose in the pain, and to honor the lives of those he had lost by living his own to the fullest. Jackson woke to the early morning light spilling through the hospital window, casting soft shadows on the sterile walls. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor was steady now, a quiet reassurance that he was indeed still alive. His body ached with a dull, persistent pain, but his mind felt sharper than it had in years. The tribunal's words and the images they had shown him replayed in his thoughts, each one demanding to be understood. Later that morning, a nurse entered the room with her usual clipboard and polite demeanor. "Good to see you looking better today," she said, checking his vitals. "Your progress has been remarkable." Jackson managed a faint smile. "Thanks. It's been an eye-opener." The nurse glanced at him, her expression curious but professional. Many patients say that after coming back from something like this, if you ever feel like talking about it, there are counselors who specialize in post-trauma care. Jackson nodded absently, but her words stuck with him. For years, he had avoided the idea of therapy, convinced that no one could truly understand the weight he carried. But now, something inside him had shifted. He realized that part of the tribunal's message was about connection, not just with others, but also with himself. Maybe sharing his story was a step toward healing. The first few days after his release from the hospital were a blur of paperwork and recovery. Jackson returned to his apartment, its familiar clutter and dim lighting welcoming him, like an old but unkind friend. He stood in the doorway, staring at the piles of unopened mail and the dust-covered photograph of his platoon on the wall. He felt the pull of his old habits, the urge to retreat into isolation, to drown his memories in the numbing monotony of television and silence. But the tribunal's message echoed in his mind. Survival is not an end. It is a beginning. He couldn't ignore it, not now. Jackson walked over to the photograph, wiping away the dust with his sleeve. The faces of his comrades stared back at him, frozen in time, their expressions filled with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. Ramirez's grin was particularly vivid, a reminder of both loss and the bonds they had shared. "You deserve better," Jackson murmured, his voice breaking. "But I'm still here, and I'm going to figure out what to do with that." Jackson's first step toward breaking the cycle came unexpectedly. Greg, the fellow veteran who had visited him in the hospital, called one evening. His voice was as gruff as ever, but there was a warmth in his tone that Jackson hadn't noticed before. "Thought I'd check in," Greg said. "How are you holding up?" Jackson hesitated. His instinct was to downplay his struggles, to brush off the question with a casual response. But the tribunal's message about living with intention and creating meaning stopped him. "I'm working on it," Jackson admitted. "It's been hard, but I'm trying to figure out what comes next." Greg chuckled softly. "Welcome to the club. It's not easy, but you don't have to do it alone. There's a group I go to, vets like us, trying to make sense of everything. You should come by." Jackson's first instinct was to refuse. The idea of sitting in a room full of strangers, sharing his pain, felt daunting. But then he remembered the threads of connection the tribunal had shown him. His survival wasn't meant to end in isolation. It was meant to create something new. He agreed to attend the meeting. The group meeting was held in the basement of a community center. The room was simple, with folding chairs arranged in a circle and a pot of coffee brewing in the corner. Jackson arrived early, his nerves frayed, but Greg greeted him with a firm handshake and a reassuring smile. As the session began, Jackson listened to the others share their stories. There were men and women of all ages, each carrying their own burdens of guilt, loss, and confusion. For the first time, Jackson felt a sense of solidarity, a reminder that he wasn't alone in his struggles. When it was his turn to speak, Jackson hesitated. The words felt heavy in his throat, but he forced them out. I've been carrying a lot of guilt," he began. "Guilt for surviving when others didn't. Guilt for not doing enough. But recently, I had an experience, a near-death experience, and it showed me something I hadn't seen before." He paused, the room silent, every pair of eyes on him. "It showed me that my survival wasn't just an accident. It's a chance, a responsibility, to make something meaningful out of what's left. I don't know how yet, but I'm here because I want to figure that out." The room remained quiet for a moment before someone spoke. "That's brave," a woman said. "Admitting that you're searching, it's the first step." Jackson felt a weight lift from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was drowning. He felt like he was learning to swim. The days that followed were filled with small but significant changes. Jackson began attending the group regularly, finding solace and inspiration in the stories of others. He also started reaching out to old squad mates, rekindling friendships that had faded over the years. Each conversation, each shared memory, felt like a thread weaving itself into the tapestry the tribunal had shown him. One afternoon, Jackson found himself sitting at his desk, staring at a blank piece of paper. He had been avoiding this moment, unsure of where to begin, but the urge to write was undeniable. He started slowly, the words halting at first but gaining momentum as he poured his thoughts onto the page. He wrote about Ramirez, about Greg, about the tribunal and the glowing threads of connection. He wrote about the guilt he had carried and the hope he was beginning to feel. By the time he finished, the page was full, and Jackson felt a sense of clarity he hadn't known before. As Jackson folded the letter and set it aside, he glanced at the photograph of his platoon on the wall. For the first time, he didn't feel overwhelmed by the faces staring back at him. Instead, he felt gratitude for their courage, for their friendship, and for the lessons they had taught him. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he was starting to understand the tribunal's message. Survival wasn't just about living. It was about creating meaning, building connections, and finding purpose. And for the first time in years, Jackson was ready to embrace that challenge. Jackson stood in front of the community center, staring at the peeling paint on the door. His heart pounded, not from fear but from anticipation. He had been coming to these meetings for months now, slowly rebuilding himself piece by piece. But tonight was different. Tonight, Jackson was here to speak. Not just to his group, but to an audience of veterans, their families, and members of the local community. Greg had encouraged him to share his story. "People need to hear it," he had said. "You've been through hell and back, and you've got something to say, something that could help others." The room was filled with a quiet hum of conversation as people settled into their seats. Jackson felt a familiar rush of nerves as he stepped up to the podium, the microphone crackling slightly as he adjusted it. He glanced at Greg, who gave him a thumbs up from the front row. Jackson took a deep breath, gripping the edges of the podium. "Good evening," he began, his voice steady but soft. "My name is Jackson Cole. I'm a veteran, and like many of you, I've spent years carrying the weight of survival." The room grew quiet, all eyes on him. Jackson felt the tension ease as he continued. "For a long time, I thought survival was a punishment. I felt guilty for the lives I couldn't save, for coming home when others didn't. I isolated myself, convinced that I didn't deserve peace. But then, something happened, something I never expected." He paused, letting the words settle. "I had a near-death experience, and in that moment, I saw something that changed me. I saw how every action, every choice, creates ripples. I saw how my survival wasn't an accident. It was a chance to create meaning." Jackson spoke about the tribunal, the glowing threads of connection, and the profound realization that his life wasn't just about himself. It was about the impact he could have on others. He shared the moments of guilt and grief that had defined his days, but he also spoke of the hope that had begun to replace them. "I realized that survival isn't the end of the story," he said. "It's the beginning of a new one. And that story is about connection, about reaching out, about helping others find their way through the darkness." He looked out at the audience, his gaze meeting theirs. Some nodded, their faces reflecting a mix of understanding and encouragement. Others wiped away tears, their own stories mirrored in Jackson's words. After the event, several people approached Jackson to thank him. One man, an older veteran with a cane, shook Jackson's hand firmly. "You've got guts, kid," he said. "I've been fighting my own battles for years, but hearing you talk, it gives me hope." A young woman, holding her toddler, spoke next. "My brother's a vet," she said, her voice trembling. "He's been struggling. I think he needs to hear this. Thank you for sharing." Jackson felt a swell of gratitude and responsibility. The tribunal's message rang in his mind. Transform your survival into meaning. These conversations, these connections, they were the ripples he was creating. Over time, Jackson's advocacy grew. He began organizing support groups, partnering with local organizations to provide resources for veterans and their families. He spoke at schools, community centers, and events, sharing his story to raise awareness about the struggles many veterans face after returning home. He also started writing, a blog where he shared not only his experiences, but also advice and encouragement for others navigating similar challenges. The blog gained traction, and soon, people from across the country were reaching out to thank him for his words. Through it all, Jackson found a sense of fulfillment he had never thought possible. The weight of his guilt didn't disappear, but it became a part of his story, a reminder of the lessons he had learned and the purpose he had found. One evening, Jackson sat on his apartment balcony, the city lights twinkling below. On the table beside him was a framed photograph of his platoon, the glass freshly cleaned. He picked it up, tracing the faces of his comrades with his fingers. "I hope I'm doing right by you," he said softly, his voice filled with both emotion and resolve. In that moment, he felt a sense of peace, a quiet but powerful affirmation that he was on the right path. The tribunal's message, the glowing threads of connection, the lives he was touching, they all came together in his mind, forming a tapestry of meaning and purpose. Jackson's journey wasn't about erasing the past. It was about transforming it. From the battlefield to the celestial tribunal to the streets of his city, he had learned that survival wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of a new one defined by connection, purpose, and the courage to live fully. Have you ever thought about the ripples your actions create, the people you touch, even in small ways? Jackson's story reminds us all that even in our darkest moments, there's a chance to create something meaningful. If this story resonated with you, please like, comment, and subscribe for more life-changing journeys. Share this video with someone who might need to hear it. Together, let's honor the threads that connect us all and create a world of understanding and purpose.